Okay, so maybe let's start with presenting you, I mean, our guests today. I will start with Caroliną Sourdis Arenas, who is a Colombian researcher and filmmaker based in Barcelona. And she made her PhD in film studies at Pompeu Fabra University, with the dissertation that I think is very pertinent for our discussion today, the essay Film as Dialectics of Film Creation. And her main interests lie in the intersection between theory and practice, again, very pertinent to our today's talk. And she explores visual-based research methodologies, particularly applied to the field of memory studies. Hi, hello. Our second guest is Magdalena Szymków, who is a journalist and filmmaker, graduated from the Wajda Film School, and she is also a co-founder of production company Westfilm, the author of many documentaries, and she is joined by Hubert Czerepok from Art Academy in Szczecin today. Our third guest in the computer framework is Stanisław Liguziński, who is a video essayist and teacher, coordinator of research programs and film festivals. He's currently working, among other things, for the Dutch Film Academy, and he's working on his PhD at Jagiellonian University. And last but not least, obviously, is Kubą Mikurda, who is also a filmmaker and film scholar. He is head or co-head. I don't know if we can make this statement. The co-head of the Institute of Art Studies. Of the Essay Film Studio at Film School in Łódź. He made a PhD on psychoanalysis and Slovenian theory in 2015. He's also the author of two documentaries, the most recent one on the Silver Globe. I mentioned already an institutional framework that is, in a sense, I think, limiting, but maybe also opening the scope of our discussion, which is Essay Film Studio, for which, in which, or with which, I think you all collaborate, work, or will collaborate or work, if not. And I think it's good to start, maybe the first question would be, in fact, to the co-heads of the studio. And it would be the most basic one possible. How you define essay film or film essay inside your institution, and how does that work for you in the practice of, leading this various research and shooting practices? So maybe let's start with an attempt to play with definition, maybe more than, we are not going to pretend it's so serious, but I think it's the good pretext to really create a certain field of
although it is serious, I mean, it is the most serious question, I guess, the most obvious and the most serious question.
That's why it would be severely censored.
Also, I guess the most difficult question, since we don't know the answer yet, and I don't know if you are going to have an answer anytime soon. I guess the first thing to say is that Essay Film Studio is part of the VN Lab initiative at the Łódź Film School, which consists of different laboratories, different workshops. There is also the VR lab and some kind of hybrid narrative studio. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, the question of an essay is the starting point for our practices and attempts at theory, because the activities of the studio are basically for both theoretical and practical, and we try to combine it in every possible respect, basically. If I were to answer this question as a sort of starting point, I would say that definitely we don't define the essay film as a genre, which is, I guess, the typical way of trying to talk about cinematic phenomena, right? That this is a genre that has some kind of specific traits, definable and trackable traits. But obviously, there is a history of defining essay film exactly like this in the history of cinema, or trying to either by showing particular conditions of an essay film, or pointing at particular names, like Chris Marker, Anis Varda, saying that this is the sort of prototypical essay film, right? This is how an essay film should look like. But for us, I guess, it's more of a methodology, or perhaps even some kind of position towards filmmaking, towards cognition in general, maybe, that that happens in the medium of film, in the sense that there is, and I guess Stan will also talk about it. It's an obvious thing to say, but an essay means to try, right? It means to try in French, and I guess this element of trying and not knowing like what the final product should look like. So this experimental element, and you can go into etymology. I mean, it's with an essay, the etymology is quite exciting, because you have experience, you have experiment, you have essaying, you have trying. So this semantic field sort of points towards not knowing what's the final final product. So I would say, like, to give Stan some space, I would say that broadly speaking, I mean, it's a way of dealing with material for us, not a particular product.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with everything that Kuba said, and we set up that seminar also, as Kuba mentioned, to try to tackle that question, and not to try to tackle that question in order to formulate the definition, but to kind of create a catalog of different gestures or different approaches to essay making. And this is why actually we're so happy that we have participants from all over, actually representing different traditions, but also different practices of making. And because of that, we actually have a forum in which we can share like the different practices of approaching this, let's say, this realm of essayistic. But I think what is important, I mean, to a degree for me, even the stake of using this term of essay is in order to take it back, because the moment, at least like when I kind of ventured into this whole field back in around like 2010, when I was finishing my master in film studies, I had this urge at some point when I was writing my thesis to use audiovisual materials as quotations in my thesis. And of course, like the written format of the thesis wasn't allowing me to do so. And kind of paradoxically, I was facing the same dilemma that was already raised back in the 70s by the writers like Raymond Bellour, for example, who at that point wrote this text where like basically this kind of seminal paper that was called Unattainable Text. And he said basically that you know, there is this jealousy from coming from media scholars and film scholars towards literary scholars, that they can freely quote and they can incorporate elements of other texts in their own theoretical works, and then they can basically build things around it in the same language or in the same kind of level, and they can still build a meta discourse on the works that they are commenting on, but within the same medium. And I think there was at least in me this desire to be able to do that. And especially that, of course, at that point, you could see like all these different forms emerging. You know, this was the kind of the high tide of blogging, for example, when people started writing blogs and embedding videos on their website. And technically, it was becoming really possible. And at this point, like I remember when I was still proposing the topic of my PhD, I did not come across the idea of video essay at the time. I called it cine writing after Agnes Varda's practice, basically, of essay film. This kind of practice that I was trying to imagine for myself to be working with. And then suddenly, actually, this whole new movement of, let's say, video essay online on YouTube and Vimeo started emerging. And it was a very interesting moment, I think, historical moment as well, because suddenly all the means of production of this kind of works became widely available. So you had free software that you could be using, but most importantly, you suddenly started having outlets. So like YouTube, Vimeo, so there was actually an audience for this. So it wasn't only limited to, let's say, like a fan base or, like fun videos, but you could really, really get an audience and really make a practice of exchange through this, like, let's say, the practice of essay making and kind of the reception of the essayistic. And I mean, I'm sorry that I'm taking such a long detour, but because suddenly this label of the essay emerged and like this idea of video essay emerged, very quickly it got let's say in this like public opinion, it got codified and this label got stuck to a very particular mode of enunciation, let's say, which was this explanatory pieces on cinema. So basically, like certain types of edits of different films or different audiovisual works that were heavily inscribed with voiceover, where it was a kind of like almost like a mode of illustrated lecture. Where of course you had this advantage of indexicality, so you could really point to the image and say, this is what I mean, and this is how it unravels, this is how it works, which was of course great. But this is, I think, in a sense, the moment where the stake of the essay became important to me, because like that's also kind of coincides with the moment that I entered Film Academy and I started practically engaging with the essay. And then I realized that the question of essay is not only the question of the mode of presentation, so the product, but the question of essay is actually a question of the process and the methodology of making. So the fact that you're making an essay and like you're making it through editing and you're recombining a footage, like even if you're making this very simple explanatory essay, a lot of what happens in that thinking process, in that associative thinking process that is happening through editing and through recombination of materials, that was something that was really precious. And I think that was something that was, for me, became the essence of why I got involved and why I stuck with it, in a sense, as this kind of why I still describe my practice as an essayistic, which is the kind of the practice of researching and the practice of discovery. And what Kuba said, of course, etymologically speaking, essay is a tryout, essay is an attempt. But it's interesting. I don't want to dominate this part too much, but if I have to say something,
well, maybe we will cut it out here for a while.
Okay.
And of course, we will be coming back to these questions, I think, all the time. But let me just bring Carolina and Magda to the discussion more, because a lot of things that you've said, I think, are possible paths of developing this talk, and we will probably do it. But I would like to know first, and here I really direct myself to Carolina and Magda, how does it look like from the other perspective? I mean, because the other meaning in this particular question, the practical work, because we started with the institutional framework. We are not limited by it so much, but let's consider it's the most institutional point of departure. And now I would like to see how it starts, the attempt, the trial starts when you think about making a movie that would be an essay. What is really the starting point? Or how would you define the methodology to bring the starting point to an essay form? Because I think, you know, when, for example, when I think about the very concept of methodology, it is not evident how it relates to the essay as an attempt or the trial, because methodology is very strict, and the experiment that you treat with methodology is a very exact thing. And the essay, I think, in order for it to be still a trial or an attempt to do something, should have a methodology that would kind of keep up with the openness of the idea. But what is the starting point, really?
You're muted, Carolina.
Sorry. Magda, do you want to start, or should I?
Yeah, please.
Start, Carolina. Okay, well, I think it's a very interesting question, and it has a lot to do with what Kuba and Stan were talking about. And I think it is related to form, because I think that the essay is also not a form, in the sense that it has a lot of possible forms to become. So in my specific case, I mean, I am also an academic in like very big quotation marks. In the sense that for me, for example, the idea of an essay didn't, my PhD is about the essay as methodology, actually, and it didn't start by the question of what the essay is, but having like a bunch of filmmakers that I felt were really interesting, and then discovering that they all had like a similar kind of work. So, for example, the idea of relating Jonas Mekas with Alexander Kluge, that are two filmmakers that the form may have nothing to do with one another, but like the essence and the processes may be similar in the idea of how they conceive editing, or how they conceive writing in relation to cinema, etc. But like as a practitioner, and I think it has a lot to do with my theoretical training, for me, there's always like a movie beneath the movie you want to make, no? And in that sense, an essay, I think, starts like any other type of film. And for me, it's like I don't discover that it has an essayistic form until it's made. For example, now I am trying to do a short film that has an essay like related to it. And I'm not sure which images go where, if they are just one film. I mean, it's something that I have to discover by doing. And I think that the essay film has a lot to do with that. That is something that you have to discover in the making, and you don't have any certainty about the form until you make it, until you close it, because at the end, an essay is a closed form as well. You know, it's like something that has an openness. And in that sense, for example, I think that Godard's work is perfect, because actually chronologically has a lot of sense in how he tested things that in another film, then you see that it's like, you know, completed and closed and more worked. So I think it's about you know, just having an open idea of what the form will be like.
Thanks. Magda, you
know, for me, I think the most important thing of doing essay films is actually thinking through images. For me, it's a reflection, a visual reflection. The essay film actually for me is these two words, the image and the reflection. And when I'm working on a film, I usually start from writing, and which is also the origin of essay itself, right? And the word is a starting point for me, and then the one image is a starting point for me. And once I have the image that in some way define the whole topic or the whole film that I want to make, I'm able to start. Maybe this image will be in the film, maybe I will never use it, but it's something that inspires me to find other images as ones who are connected to each other. But I think the most important thing for me, for my films, but also essay films that I'm watching, is that I'm following the process of the director. Because I think that essay films are the most personal and subjective form of a film, because it's usually it's in the first person, even if there is a voiceover or not. I'm able through images and the choice of the images, and also the way how director is editing the film. So the cuts and how they are connected between each others, for me, is the language of the director, and I'm following his or her style. And I would say that is a thinking, is an image, and is a stilo. So it's a character of the writing that you have. So when I'm working on my films, I'm always trying to find this form, which is composed from these three elements. And what Stanislav said, this process is something like an artistic research, right? That through the image, through this thinking, through this process, I'm doing in some way my research. It's not a research through the academic tools, let's say, but through artistic tools. And it's not only something that I enjoy, but I also think it's really good, and I enjoy a lot doing with students. And I think it's also the good tool for students, not only of cinema or art, but in any topics to develop theses or work through this form of film. And in nowadays reality, which is so much based on image everywhere, I think it's also the possibility to work with younger. That's the way that I'm seeing the essay, and also the use of it.
Yeah, one quick follow-up maybe to the last two answers, because I think it's interesting what you said about the image that stands in a certain sense in the origin of the whole process of working on the film, although it can never appear in it as a fragment or a frame, etc. And what Carolina said about this essence versus form. This is how I wrote it down, at least, because you said, sometimes you liked to juxtapose filmmakers as different, one could say, as Jonas Mekas or Kluge, for example, but there is something deeper that connects them. Isn't it somehow close to this kind of either image or idea that finds its way through the film form, but it's not really a film style in this traditional sense? Is it corresponding in any sense?
Yes, I definitely think that it's not about form at all. I mean, it's not about, I think that there is a time in film history where actually there is a new form that actually suddenly we have like a lot of diaries, and we have this kind of very experiment. For example, Godard work in television, for me, it's like crucial to understand the essay film and the Francophone essay film, but also like the idea of developing a form through practice. That is what Magda was saying, no? And I definitely sense that there was a time where the essayistic form in cinema might be something new, no? I'm also thinking about Pasolini's notes on how to make a film, the African Orestiada, but I think that this form has codificated like through years, and like now it's very easy to think about a film essay, like to pre-think the film essay that you want to make. It might be easier, you say, okay, I have some footage, maybe I have a voice, maybe I don't, then you have the editing. But so I feel that like in that discovery of how to actually discover the form that you can do with some images or sounds or reflection, I think that there is like the fertile sand for the essay film, when you don't quite know if you're going to put a voiceover. I mean, of course, an essay film is personal, but I believe that every work is personal. Fiction is personal, and documentary is personal, and writing is personal. It's like an author is always reflected in what they do. So what I think that for me, what makes an essay like a methodology, like Kuba and Stan were saying, is precisely that, maybe that idea about the doubt or the uncertainty as a kind of motor for creating. It's like you don't know. I think that not knowing the essay film is super important. Actually not knowing what you're going to do, and then discover it while you work on the images. And that is Farocki, and that is David Perlov, no, and his diaries, that I think are also super important to understand the essay film as a form in cinema, or a lot more. But I think that not knowing and actually discovering through the making is super important.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I would like.
Can I just do the follow-up to this, because I just want to add one thing, because I think what Carolina said about different forms emerging in different times, and there are dominating forms of the essayistic, I think, in many times in history, and it's very interesting for me because it seems that it always coincides with this kind of dominating interfaces of thinking in a given period of time. So basically, if Carolina says now about the Francophone tradition, and like, let's say there is almost like you can discern probably two, because there's the first one that comes directly from this idea of Alexander Astruk, and this idea of camera stylo, which is basically, like the camera as a pen. So the function of the essay would be basically a translation of the process of writing into cinema. And then, of course, all the metaphors that follow, which is Agnes Varda's scene writing and all that. And this is really how the cinema at the time and the form of the essayistic deals with thinking the equivalence of writing, but with camera. So basically, what could that mean to try to think the process of thinking by comparing the camera to pen? And then what you just said about Godard, this is actually where the video comes in, and the TV, and like very different modes of production that are being introduced. And I think what is happening right now, what we see, is this first wave of internet video essays that were very much dictated by the formula of the movies that were being shown on YouTube at that time. And there is, for example, new formula right now that is emerging thanks to Kevin Lee, for example, that is desktop documentary. And again, like desktop is now a main interface of thinking for most of us. And that kind of takes the center stage of and becomes the dominating form, I think, of essayistic production nowadays. Just as a footnote.
It's a very good follow-up, which is also a provision of my next question. So okay. I'm lost in time a little bit, but no. I was thinking about exactly. What Carolina said about the codification of certain forms or perhaps certain gestures of film essay, and coming back to the very start, and the question that Kuba, I would say, not raised but isolated or shut down, the question of the genre, because isn't the genre just a set of codified, I don't know how to call it, because it's not about narrative modes, really. It's not about cinematographic takes. I think it's something in between. I would say it's like a topoi of film forms that, get more and more codified, and that's how we create or recognize a genre, no? Because there is no metaphysical definition of it anywhere. It's just the dominant code of, for example, film narrative, but which coincides with all the cinematography that is used to it. So I think what you said, Staszek, is kind of a suggestion that we already have a certain amount of gestures or forms that are codified, and we also live in a moment of another codification, which is maybe not over yet, but there is a dominant tone. So could you? It's a question to everyone who would like to step in. How would you describe this situation today? What are those strong moments and margins or dominant essay forms and maybe emerging essay forms in cinema?
So perhaps just as a follow-up, but also maybe a frame for next answers, I would just say that there was always, like, when you think about the history of an essay, both literary essay and film essay, there was always something paradoxical about the form, however you want to call it. And so because it was always both subjective, at the same time, not only subjective, but trying to express something more than subjective, right? Trying to produce some kind of knowledge which would not be just a subjective knowledge, just this kind of narcissistic navel gazing, but something that emerges from the subjective position, but at the same time, and acknowledges the subjective position, but at the same time aims at something larger, something more universal. So you start with something particular, but it's your subjective position, but aim at something universal. So this is the first sort of paradox. The second paradox is this strange position between, as Magda said, artistic research. What is artistic research? Strange position between for art strategies and for scientific sort of approaches, which kind of often put essay into this no man's land. For example, for a form that for art is too scientific, and for scientists it's too arty in a way, right? It's not serious in a way. The third paradox would be a paradox of the autonomous and the derivative, right? Is it an autonomous sort of form? Because quite often, more often than not, it uses some kind of pre-existing material, and it was also the case with the literary essay, right? That it's a commentary, it's something that was inspired by us with I know this is Stan's sort of favorite definition, one of the most favorite definitions of an essay film by Georgi Lukács, which is thoughts occasioned by, right? So this is something that needs a starting point. It needs something to work with from the very beginning. And obviously this sort of heterogeneity and the possibility of mixing different genres of different languages, different registers, and it was always present in the literary essay from the very beginning, from Montaigne, basically, right? But at the same time, speaking about and it also, I guess it also, if it means that when we talk about genre, there is always this kind of paradox is also present, that this is a sort of self-subverting genre in a way. It's a genre that emerges as such as for a brief moment, and like I guess this is when the moment you think you can define an essay is the moment you actually should make a new one. In a way, that would sort of subvert or confront this framework. Because I guess when you look at the history of film essay, it was always, again, speaking about the derivative aspect of it, it was always very much conditioned by the dominating modes of visual production in a way. So cinematic, television, internet, and stuff. And I guess you could codify this gesture, but according to this dominating sort of strategies, right? Once the framework, once the interface sort of changes, you need to reinvent it again. And the only common element in this would be the sort of critical approach towards the dominating interface or dispositive or whatever you want to call it.
Guys, what would you
Yeah, I think coming back to your question, Paweł, I think there is for me, there's a bit of a difference between the gesture and the inscription of gesture. And I think this is what Carolina was pointing to when she was talking about the form and like kind of the multiplicity of forms. I think for me, one thing that almost always, because like there's all of those historical traditions, and of course the same way as convention of realism changes in cinema, I think in a way, you know, like the kind of the essayistic and what is recognized as the essayistic also changes. But I think one thing sticks to a certain degree. I mean, it would probably stick to most of the films that you would look at and say that they have something essayistic about them, is that they follow the logic of the unraveling of thought. So if you think about like how the narrative is structured, it's a logic of how the thought unravels in a way, like, you know, like how. So it's usually how they're structured in a kind of a narrative sense, despite, I mean, most of the time, despite how formally otherwise they can be made. But as I say, like there is a gesture on one side, and for me that gesture is crucial here, because also what Carolina was talking about, where the essay grows from doubt. What I really like, there is this text by Willem Flusser when he's describing the gesture of making. And in that description of the gesture of making, like he described the gesture of researching as well. And for me, like essay is basically a beautiful methodology of research, which is the research without basically that is going against comprehension. So basically, I mean, if there's a comprehension, then there's no point of researching. I mean, if there's understanding, then the researching has no place, because researching is actually questioning or is putting something to doubt. But what he proposes is like he proposes this epistemological model that is not based on thought or like, you know, like the relationship between, let's say, the mind and the eye. He's proposing epistemological model that is basically based on the relationship between the mind and hand. So he says basically there's something in the gesture of making and in this thinking through making that basically is easier to grasp if you think about the process of thinking as the process of grabbing. And of course, you know, like he uses all these metaphors of grasping something, getting something, you know, that the kind of hand gestures imply. But he says, if we think about this as a model of thinking, he says that this is a more dangerous model, less stable in a way, because we don't master the object in the same way we can do it with eyes. And also, but there is something about the object that the object always gives us feedback. So if we reach out and we grab something, and we want to squeeze it, or we have certain assumption about how soft that object is or how it will react to our hand, the object can actually push back. And I think what is beautiful about this kind of, what is for me attractive about this kind of essayistic manner of working is actually this, that you have certain assumptions, you start working with certain material, start putting it together, and the material resists. The material pushes back. The material gives you back information that make you change your gestures and make you change your strategies, because it just doesn't work. And it's kind of this element of pushing back and forth and back and forth. So for me, this modality of thinking through grasping in that manner is, I think, maybe captures for what me is essentially an essayistic gesture.
Of course, you all are invited to continue this line of thought. Just I would maybe mention remind what Magda said in her first answer, that, and I think it somehow resonates with what I thought while you were presenting this, let's say, genealogy of different forms of film essay, because I thought whether this relation between the film essay and, as you said, an interface, a dominant interface, or a dominant dispositive of visual dispositive at the time, is it a kind of, wouldn't it be better to say that the essay starts by diverging from certain dominant mode of visual productions? For example, when you say that, I mean, I think probably that is what in Bellur's definition would be also interesting, that he says, you know, it's about actually film scholars that want to quote certain images, but it's also about creating reflection which would not be academic purely. And would enter a different zone. And when, I don't know, Godard is making his first video essays, it's about how to counter the television at least in its most idiotic appearances. So, and I think about it in context of what Magda said, because you underscored that this is about visual reflection. So maybe the essay would, you know, every time and in every moment historically would start with a question how to make images think again in a moment in which images are more and more codified and by consequence deprived of reflection. Wouldn't it be tempting, this line of
Yeah, I think it's also interesting if we go back at the beginning of the essay film in France in 50s, when they just established the Cinémathèque Française and also the Ciné Club, this kind of a net of club founded in around cinemas, where people were coming to discuss after the screening, and that was also the beginning of the essay magazines who were reflecting on the cinema, and from this kind of text who were written, by the way, by Godard, Bézin, and others. They start to develop the idea of essay films. But all of this, it was an answer for also television, who was just growing up, and also for the cinema industry, which was mostly dedicated to entertainment. So the Cine Club and the essay in consequence, it was something like a, contrast or concurrence for cinema in that days. And maybe that's also the answer that we put at the description of our meeting, why the essay films are coming back, and they're more and more popular in film festivals, and people, also viewers, are looking for them, because it's also an answer, also the choice for different kind of cinema, intellectual cinema, as I think Godard call it. Not the physical, not emotional cinema, but intellectual cinema.
I would have to disagree with Magda in the sense that, I mean, sorry, but is the essayistic more intellectual than emotional? Would you affirm that?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Like, do you consider that the essayistic is more intellectual than emotional?
I think yes. Of course, emotion in it is of course something that we enjoy and we appreciate. But the base was, I think the base is just the process of thinking. So it's intellectual.
But we think through the senses as well. And we think through different, I mean, I agree in the sense that yes, it is how the academic history of the essay film has been like written. But I do think that there is like a plastic, emotional, physical, performative part of the essay that makes it like, I mean, that for me, it's very difficult to think apart, no? Of course, there are like super intellectual filmmakers like Kluge, for example. I think that his films are like super cold and he's always, but for example, if you think about mechas, no, that for me are the two very opposite forms, but very similar processes. And it's a completely like experience, a film full of experience. And I think that experience is like another part of the essay that is very important, in the sense that, or for me, like the the golden era of the essay film, let's say in the 70s with Godard and with David Perloff. And it's about something happens when you make this film, and it happens through experience. It doesn't happen through thought, let's say theoretical, let's say disengaged from the body. And for me, the essay film has that has like a very strong process. I mean, there are a lot of types of essay films, no? Like we were talking before, and of course, there's also essays that are super intellectual. But I think that we have to think the essay film also through the plasticity of images, through the plasticity of music. I think that it has a lot to do with poetry, actually, and it's like a wave, you know, that it can be in one shore, then in another shore, and it comes back and forth. And for example, that is very clear in Godard. Like if you see Histoire du Cinéma and you really like read what he's saying about Foucault, it could be like super debatable, you know. It's like, it could be like a, you know, but formally, like the theory is used more in its plastic way. Well, for me, I think that is very important in the essay, because we are not writing, you know. Writing doesn't have a concrete counterpart. An idea is an idea, but in the essay film, an idea is also an image or a sound or a relation between two images, and in that sense, it always have like a concrete thing that makes it completely different than a intellectual experience.
I think what is also interesting that Godard said that the essay film is a form which think. And I think that the message which is behind, the thinking which is behind is intellectual, and that's one thing. And the image makes emotions. That's, I think, the combine these two things makes the most powerful essay films. But sometimes we have a starting point, which is a question, and we have the ending point, which is still a question, right? And the arc between is the emotion, I think. And the intellectual trying to find answers and making others questions is intellectual. So I think what is actually what is coming also from literature, right? We have words, we have phrases, we have some ideas behind, but still we find emotion in it. But I think the base of it and the beginning was a thought. It's what I mean in that way. And maybe the emotion is also, or maybe the intellectual is also the form as well.
But for example, in that respect, I think that it's super interesting to think about, for example, Pasolini's work on his notes, no? That it's also this idea of writing with the images, no? And for example, you can see Pasolini's theoretical writings that are nice, but of course, I mean, that don't have like the theoretical deepness that his films have, no? And in that sense, for example, there is a very interesting text that I think everybody that is thinking about the essay should read to understand why it's not a good idea to define the essay. That is In Search of the Centaur of Philippe Lopato.
Yeah.
And in that text,
sorry, could you repeat?
Yes, and he says like, it is called In Search of the Centaur, like In Search of the Centaur, Notes on the Essay Film, something like that, and it's by Philippe Lopato. And in this, it's like one of the first writings about the essay, like academic writings, and he says like there are like 5 things that an essay has to have. It has to have words. It has to be written in such like in a rhetoric way that it's, you know, he states some of the principles, and in fact he says like it's very sad to see Pasolini's work, notes of how do you say it in English, location scouting to Palestina, because such a deep writer, how comes that he's so purely eloquating this film? And what happens in this movie? In this movie, Pasolini goes to look for actors in Palestina, he shoots some people, then he goes back to Italy, and he just needs to make like a film for his producer. And he just puts the material and starts thinking what is happening in his head. So he says like, these faces doesn't work. This thing, you would never could use it in a film about Christ or whatever. But the point is that this first relation of the director or the author towards the material, and these first sparks of ideas or intellect, whatever, they wouldn't exist if you didn't have the image. I mean, the image comes first. The image sparks the idea, not the other way around. It's not the idea that is sparking the image, but it's like a twofold relation. I think that, of course, we can say that the essay film is an intellectual operation, but it's an intellectual operation that is it's not the same as just writing. It's not the same as literature. It has to do with a concrete idea. I mean, if you read a tree is green, you can imagine any tree. But if you have an image, it's that tree, and that gives a specific. It's concrete. So I think that in that sense, I would not say that the essay film is an intellectual operation. Well,
what I find interesting,
it's an opinion.
What I find interesting in this opposition that you're putting forward is, this idea that the intellectual process is dispassionate. For me, actually, intellectual process is very passionate, and of course, there is this kind of imposed academic standard that you should make it as dispassionate as possible. But for me, there would be no point or interest for me to engage in any intellectual work if I wasn't passionate and invested in the process in the first place. So I don't think those are two exclusive things in any manner.
I think when you look at why essay in literary realm is so important, and why it is important, although less and less present in the academic field, is I think exactly the same struggle as I meant. I don't know if that makes sense, but for me, if essay is an attempt to make images think again, it's the same as in the literary essay. It's about, rearranging the possibility of thinking, because thinking is also a process that is codified and is frozen in methodologies, concepts, and so on. And it is in the essay that you actually reopen the question, what is thinking? Because through concepts, you already have it. The German Begriff is exactly this. You already grasped it. And you made a complete form and cut it out from the rest of it. And in the essay, you actually fight for the thinking to be still possible. And I think in this regard, I also would say that essay is intellectual, but not in the sense that it is devoid of all other qualities, in a sense. Histories of cinema for me by Godard are extremely emotional at times, and extremely theoretical at the same time, which is a very good combination. And so I think that maybe here again, maybe it's not the only point, but here again, I think that film essay and the question of the essay in general is somehow very much connected, no? But maybe I will like to force you a little bit to get more contemporary, maybe. I don't know. I'm not trying to suggest that we are, talking about old stuff and it's boring, not at all. But it's also a question that I have in mind as someone who really stopped at, let's maybe not Pasolini, but not much later. And I would like to really know how you think about this sphere of film essay today. Staszek mentioned, if I'm not taking it about the desktop essay form, which I, to be honest, have never heard about. And I think some of our listeners could have the same problem. So I would like you to maybe say what is, according to you, this dominant mode, or what modes of contemporary film essay production are for you the most interesting or inspiring. That would be maybe more diverse among you all. I just want to mention one thing for our audience, which is limited. That's why I don't want to make this moment, you know, now you ask questions, because it would be maybe more intrusive than usually. So just, I would like to make it clear, if you want to intervene at any time, comment and ask questions, etc., you're more than welcome. But I don't want to, you know, pinpoint you at any moment. So I'll just observe your attempts if there are any. Okay, so let's maybe try this attempt to this, you know, contemporary landscape of essay, how it functions today. You can start by any. No. I mean, I think Staszek is already eager to start, but if anyone else wants to. Yeah, go on. Maybe you.
Go, Stan. Go for it.
Oh, Kuba, I thought you were getting ready for the mic. It's interesting. I mean, I think there are two things. There's something that Kuba said before. Like at some point that when something becomes dominant, this is the time to kill it. I think also, and to steer in another direction. And what you said before, Paweł, about like doing this against something, I would not say that it's maybe most often against something. It's more like, you know, kind of Agamben's idea of profanation, that you just restore something to free use and you just modify that. So I would say that there is definitely dominant modes of producing what is widely considered a video essay or essay film right now. And there is this differentiation still. Although like we as makers, like we often now kind of drift from one context to another. And actually, you know, like we're all here, as we sit here, we're kind of drifting between academia and making and different contexts of pedagogy and you know, and internet, and we make for different screens as well. But still kind of somehow this differentiation between video essay and essay film holds, because in a sense, essay film is still a film. So it's produced more in this kind of dispositive of cinema to a certain degree for, let's say, cinema screens. So this I would for a moment leave aside. But if we're looking about the biggest bulk of the production, this is now this explanatory essay, video essays, that you can find on all the popular media like video streaming platforms. So like basically Vimeo and YouTube. And it's incredible news from yesterday. I don't know if you all heard. David Fincher, together with Netflix, just announced that they're going to be making a series of video essays for Netflix by David Fincher on cinema. So I mean, it's going mainstream completely right now, and like those channels on YouTube, they are basically proliferating like every day. It started with this very inventive channels, like, you know, the channel by Tony Zhu, which is called Every Frame a Painting, which were incredibly insightful, still very explanatory, but incredibly insightful pieces that were using editing and visual thinking as much as explanatory mode. Right now, because it's done by so many people, it's actually becoming more and more boring, because a lot of those, I mean, there's a lot of fantastic makers there that do those explanatory things, but the big bulk of production is basically narrated PowerPoints. And, you know, like basically it's like image after image after image after image with voiceover. And in a way, the grandfather of many of those forms that are now online is Kevin Billy, who's made like 1,500 of those. And he started making those explanatory essays 8-9 years ago. And it was funny because at some point when he realized that everybody else on the internet is making those right now, like he basically got like terrified, and you know, he ran, and he ran forwards trying to create new forms. And as he was creating them, they were being embraced and basically turning into those like codified formulaic forms that were basically are chasing him still. but he's one of the most interesting innovators right now, because like he does something that is being codified and he does something new. And when he was escaping this explanatory mode and like all these explanatory essays that are most often, they started being about cinema. So it's like, what is Twin Peaks about? What's so good about Mulholland Drive? You know, like, and all this kind of essays. And they morphed into this category of supercuts. So basically, all shots of hands in Robert Bresson, you know, all shots, all the scenes where Sean Bean dies, or, you know, Nicolas Cage losing his shit, which is actually the masterpiece of the supercut, when like all the scenes where Nicolas Cage loses his shit. But kind of escaping this formula, Kevin actually did this essay, I think it was 6 years ago. It was called Transformers Pre-Make. And he was actually graduated from art school at that point himself as well. And he wanted to understand the ecosystem behind the big blockbuster productions. So like it was pertaining to Transformers at that time. But from the position of a spectator, of like a media consumer. So he says like basically we all consume it through desktops, through YouTube, through all this kind of things. So he wanted to use the same interface. And there's actually one more interesting thing that comes in here. What Kuba said before and what Carolina said before, like, you know, you need to create for yourself conditions to be able to think through making, which is not so easy in the normal, let's say, circumstances of film production, where you usually need to have a script first and, you know, all things pre-prepared. So suddenly that desktop became a space of freedom, because on the desktop, you can arrange things as you want, you can play with it, you can just animate. And Kevin embraced all these possibilities, because, for example, that essay has pretty elaborate animations showing the flights and the movements of things, but he did them all in Prezi. I don't know if anybody still remembers Prezi, which was this kind of elaborate PowerPoint that was
horrible
moving. Exactly. But I mean, it was a beautiful tool. If you just screen captured what was happening, it was actually creating animations from under, you know, the tip of your finger. And he really made, like, I really advise everyone, it's on Vimeo, Transformers Pre-Make, really beautiful piece to watch. And he really analyzes how big studios basically create anticipation of a movie, but also how they censor a lot of things, how they make this deals with China and like Detroit and everything. But he does this whole investigation from behind his computer screen, and you see it in basically it's reconstructing his thinking process through desktop. And suddenly right now, like most of the academic essays that are being done in the context of you know, film studies courses and everything are actually, the desktop documentary is a dominant form of academic video essays at this point. And there are innovators like Chloe Gilbert-Lane, for example, who works a lot with Kevin as well, but she does those essays, and she's also trying to find which subjects are best approached through this kind of desktop formulas. And she does incredible job as well doing that. And she's also very self-referential in the way that she's trying to analyze this obsession that each one of us through our desktop become now like little detective, and like, you know, we're investigating things because we don't believe anyone and we don't trust anyone anymore. So I would say this is one of the big dominant forms nowadays. But again, like Kevin, for example, made the next step already that a lot of people are following again, because a lot of people are trying to introduce performative elements right now to their essays. So there's Johannes Binotto as well, who does these things where he projects things on the wall, and then he steps in and he still analyzes cinema, but he tries to include his own body. And Kevin did the same thing. How is it called? Explosive Paradox. Beautiful essay from last year. Also, I recommend to everyone, where he is basically performing throughout this whole essay. He drives to a cinema where he saw Platoon with his parents when he was a kid, and he's Asian American. And like basically he reconstructs the kind of a trauma that it caused for him at school, being bullied after Platoon and all this kind of things. And he tries to show how the same spectatorial experience brought different consequences of, you know, on different people. And like, you know, so this is I think what is, for me, it's very exciting what's happening in this direction, this performative direction. And for me, all the forms that are now embracing new media, so also interactivity and also VR, actually. But that's my private obsession, because I'm also working with VR. So that's for me a very interesting extension.
We have to also consider that this distinguish between the video essay, which takes as a subject the film. So there are film about the films, and the essay films, who just are the essay on certain topic, right? Not essentially the film itself. And in that case, we can also find different tools to tell and to follow this reflection. And it could be a pure documentary method, right? Like Patrice Guzman, who just followed the story of the stars, just to tell and to show the example of desaparecidos in Chile. Or we can use, my favorite, of course, found footage, right? When we are using the footage and the images already made for other films or for other purpose, to use them and to elaborate a discourse on something else. And it could be historical topic like Farocki was doing, or we can use footage of our own home movies archive, like Alan Berliner was using, just to tell stories about his own family. And we can go on. And actually, what is I think interesting in this kind of Nikia film, let's say, that almost every director has his own way of telling stories, and that is most powerful for me. Even you are using still the archives, or you are still using the footage from the cinema, you are able to elaborate your own style. And I think nowadays the desktop cinema is very popular. But I think also the images from telephone camera are more and more used by my young people, young director as well. And some maybe experimental methods, which our students are using here in Szczecin as well. So it's a big range of telling this story, not only through this fiction cinema, right?
Yes, and I also think that one interesting path that I have seen lately is also like bringing back fiction to the essayistic. There is a film that is called The Metamorphosis of Birds from Catalina Vasconcelos. She's from Portugal. And it's a film, well, it has to do with her own history, her own family history, and a house that is getting empty. But it's super interesting because she works with correspondence, with letters. Of course, this is a kind of film to show, in theaters, which, what Stan was saying, to live apart in a certain way. But it's very interesting how the archives and how the footage can be fictionalized as well, and how fiction is always like beneath the essayistic in a way, or can be. So I think this is very interesting. Also, I don't know if you saw the last film, not the last, but Almodóvar's Pain and Glory. That is his. I think that film is very interesting because it has a lot of essayistic traces, in the sense that he is telling his own history as a filmmaker, and Banderas is interpreting Almodóvar, and there are some traces that are interesting to see from the face of the essayistic. I mean, I think that the essayistic is also interesting, like a spectator, no? To just kind of identify this kind of essayistic traces in a film that is not an essay film, because usually there are some. So that is also interesting.
Yeah, and I think what you touch upon here is also very interesting. Of course, essay doesn't always do it, but very often it codifies this mode of spectatorship that is actually kind of like this active spectatorship. I think someone in the studio called it a third space. I think also after someone, I don't think it was the kind of the original invention. yeah, this mode in which you can still retain immersion. It doesn't have to be a complete alienation or like detachment, this kind of Brechtian detachment, but I mean you can balance, I think, and especially using fiction. That's you can use a genre also to engage. It's very interesting, something that I think we discussed a lot in the studio, how you can use genres that by themselves naturally codify a certain way of spectating that is underpinned with suspicion. So, for example, using a convention of crime or or a courtroom drama in order to set up the stake and to involve a spectator, but to involve them within the frame of fiction that is engaging, but that triggers those thinking processes. And I think, of course, this film doesn't do it per se, but I mean, for me, a nice example of a movie that was just in cinemas in Poland as well was Bad Luck Banging or the Loony Porn, the new movie by Radu Jude, the Romanian movie, which I find to be essayistic. I mean, of course,
you think it's a thriller?
No, I think it's an interesting case of an essay film, a fictional essay film.
Yeah.
But it is a thriller to a certain degree. It's of course it flirts with a convention of porn, but it's also. I mean, I'm dreading that confrontation between her and the parents, and it's really dreadful. So I don't know, Carolina, if you have a chance, and Magda to see it, but it's highly recommended.
Okay, maybe the last thing I would ask you to do is, I think at the end we could permit ourselves, I mean, you can permit yourselves to make a sort of advertisements. And maybe it's good to say two things. First, to maybe more concretely present what the film studio is actually doing, in a sense of what kind of essay films are now in production, or what kind of directions are kind of emerging from your work. And for those of you who are now working on a movie, practically, it would be maybe interesting to hear a couple of things about how you proceed, how you approach it, and what it would eventually, hopefully, look like. And again, the order of answers is open. Maybe let's not start with Staszek this time. But anyone.
Yeah, I mean, as for the Essay Film Studio, we've just finished the process of selecting projects for next year for production. There are like basically 5 essay films that will be produced, and they are very different. It's difficult to say like if there is like common thread, but these are projects from Poland, from Iran, from Hong Kong, and from the Netherlands. 2 projects from Poland, and but again, I mean, 3 of them work with found footage material, but these are very different found footage materials. For example, in the Iranian project, these are the home movies by Iranian home movies collected by the author, and he wants to create some kind of visual poem or insight into this very rare perspective into Iranian home life.
But by creating fictionalized POV, so like kind of like by suggesting an actual person that is
behind it. So there's a fictional framework, but it's again this kind of paradoxical or heterogeneous aspect of it. It's very clear. The project from the Netherlands is basically about working with home videos, the author's own home videos, VHSs, and re-editing them. The authors are siblings, and they're both visual artists, but in very different. They have their very different styles and work in different fields, but they will try to sort of negotiate their visual past by editing these materials.
It's a brother and sister, and the sister is a visual artist. She works in this kind of very detached manner, like very analytical. And the brother is a documentary filmmaker who is working this super emotional, and like he's kind of like always spilling his heart out. So it's going to be an interesting clash as well.
Yeah, and the third one, the Polish one, actually points towards our second initiative, because this is a project that will work prominently with the footage from the WFO, Wytwórnia Filmów Oświatowych, which is the educational film studio in Łódź, which is probably the biggest and the most exciting archival discovery in years, I would say. I mean, they have incredible amounts of footage, like be it complete films, educational films, starting with the 50s towards the 90s, very different genres, very different approaches, but also for basically tons of unused footage for these films and for other films which they collected along the way. So and this project is very interesting, because it's a project by Tomasz Węgorzewski, theater director, that actually already has created a number of like this theatrical essayistic, I would say, forms. And I would say that there's a very interesting connection between the post sort of dramatical approach in theater and the essayistic in film. And I'm very excited that actually, because I dreamt that it will happen, that someone from the theater field would enter the film field with similar sort of approach, and we can see what works, what doesn't, right? What translates into the film from the theater field. And WFO, I mean, we have a research group, we have an archival group that will create 5 to 10 short film essays out of the WFO film studio for footage. And I myself am making I don't know if it will be a feature film or a mid-length film, but basically it would be an essay about Solaris, Stanisławem Solaris, edited from scientific footage from the 1960s and 1950s from educational film studios. So basically from the time when Lem wrote Solaris, right? And we'll try to somehow dig into this images. And again, the properly exciting thing about it is that no one has seen it before. I mean, they were, well, for many years. I mean, they were distributed in the 50s and the 60s, but from that moment on, I mean, they were basically out of the circuit. So this is quite exciting, and we still continue with the seminar, and we've already have a number of like great guests in the seminars. Laura Mulvey, we'll have Mark Cousins next January, Kevin Billy. So basically, people who really, have their hands in the material in a way. They really are doing stuff right now. As Stan said, Kevin Billy is a phenomenon. He's like an essay man, film essay person, right? I mean, he recreates genres, and then he
became an essay.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite incredible. He really like creates these genres, and then he transgresses them. and he himself is like the history of the internet essay film.
I think New York Times once wrote about him. He's a Shakespeare video essay.
He would embrace it, I'm sure.
Oh.
And basically, and this is a project we're making with Stan. So it's maybe Stan talk a little bit about the essay method.
Yeah, later. I mean, I think that there's super exciting project by Carolina as well. I mean, it's not unfortunately within the scheme of the grant of the studio. We almost, but unfortunately. But maybe Carolina, you can say something about that, because I think both in the frame of fictionalization on one hand, but also on this, I mean, the relationship between those two pieces. I mean, I'm super stoked about this project. So.
Well, I am right in the part where everything is super open, and really I'm not sure how it is going to come out. But yes, my project is like an essay film about a short film that I just shot, in which I was working with my mother and my sister as performers. And it's about how, well, I am from Colombia, but I lived in Spain a long time ago. And it's about how the narratives of the Colombian armed conflict become like a very intimate narrative in Colombian, let's say, society. So I made this fiction film that I was able to produce, and the idea about the essay film is actually like going deeper into the filmmakers that are referent for the project, but also about the experience of directing my mother and my sister. And there's also like incorporating all my footage, like my personal footage that was like the basis for the script, for the fiction script. So I am now like finishing the shooting here in Bogota. And yes, I'm not sure if, if it's actually, I'm not sure if I do have the two movies or if it's just one movie, about the whole experience and reflection of what making cinema is in the end.
Thank you. Maybe Magda, would you like to announce or talk about your work, either as a filmmaker or maybe also your work with students? We could have a counterpart to the film studio.
Maybe about students and working with them, Hubert will be more the right person to say about. He has more experience here, especially in Academia in Szczecin. I can only say a few words about my next project, which is a found footage film based on the interviews, and it will be actually the conversation which was never made with the writer. And actually it will be film about the essence of creation, and I will point a lot of questions about what is to create, what it means to describe the reality, and how much we can design it again, and which is the limit of the true and false, and actually the answers I will find hopefully in the process of doing that film. So it's a film about the creation, but actually the film itself gives me the answer about what is it. About the work here in our academy, I think what we
maybe Hubert could also jump in if you like.
Okay, so basically we're running, both of us, we're running an experimental film studio, and we believe that the experiment is actually a freedom to head to a solution or to a product, to a film. So therefore, our students, they come with ideas. I mean, of course, we provoke them to just to go certain directions through our, let's say, tasks we give to them. And they come with ideas, and then we discuss possible forms or possible directions, in a sense. Would it be something documentary looking like, or would it be feature like, or would it be reenacting a situation, or would it be performing, or would it be found footage based film? So therefore, I think that all those means they perfectly fit the the concept of an essay, because we just learning through process. So we finding solutions through process. And when you if you want to experiment anything, you can't know results, because an experiment doesn't make any sense in that very situation. So, you experiment with something what you sense, or what you kind of think that there would be some sort of answer. So there is also space for failure, which I think failure is very crucial experience in creation. Yeah. So what we're trying to do in our studio, more or less.
I think that could be a topic of another discussion with all kinds of quotations and examples, about the failed film essays. Staszek, are you making any film recently, among other things that you do?
Yeah, I mean, there are two things in the making. I mean, one is a VR project, so like it's kind of beside the point.
That's two. I'm surprised.
Yeah, that's kind of beside the point. But I can announce I'm so happy because I just got the news like 2 or 3 weeks ago that we got funding from Berlin Median Board, so we will move ahead soon. But when it comes to let's say more essayistic and more things that are more in the frames of cinema, then together with Kuba, we want to develop an essay film that is an essay on the method of the essayistic. I mean, it's super meta, but basically, instead of like when we planned the studio for the first time, in the grant there was this I don't want to say requirement, but there was something written in the grant that it should end with a certain form of publication, so like a summary of the results. And as Kuba said before, like studio is both a practical and a research, so it's basically practice-based research initiative. And we are together also like coming together and thinking what that essay could be. And we don't want to define it in terms of a definition, but we just invite different guests and we talk with them about the specific gestures that they propose. So I think like there is Katrin Grant, who came with this idea of defamiliarization, for example. So kind of the essay being this constant move of defamiliarization and other gestures. And at some point, this became my idea also for. I mean, I've been doing a PhD on the subject for a decade now. So I mean,
that would be a combatant essay on the essay form.
Yeah, and at some point, I got stuck with this approach, which is probably the closest to me, and I think to what Carolina described as her approach. That is basically not trying to find the essence of the essayistic, but define certain crucial gestures that for me that's somehow embody this approach. And with Kuba, instead of publishing a book after the whole cycle of the seminars, we actually want to make a film out of those seminars. But I mean, we won't use literally the footage, although we're recording all the sessions, but we actually want to use all the discussions that happened in the seminars in order to kind of make a film in the end about different approaches to the essay and the kind of different gestures that constitute different methods. And we do hope that it can be both an interesting essay, but also a pedagogical tool, hopefully, eventually.
Or an interesting failure.
Or an interesting failure, yeah. So that's definitely something that we'll be busy with next year, in terms of the essayistic.
Okay, that sounds terrifying,
yes.
but intriguing at the same time. The film essay form would find its final resolution and definite definition, and in essayistic form, obviously. Okay, I think we can put a final, how to say, I don't know. Yeah, I think we are going to end now our discussion. Maybe there are some things that you are eager to raise and that were omitted, ignored, or in any sense cancelled from this discussion. But if not, I think we raised so many questions and so many possible directions to think further that our listeners and late audience through internet would have a lot of material to think through. Okay, thanks very much for joining our discussion, for the guests and for our audience as well. And well, see you soon in front of the screens.
Path. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks and take care.
Thank you, Paweł, for moderating.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Carolina. Thanks, Magda. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks you for inviting us.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.